I need your guys' help as we get going here. You guys need to kind of figure out what your key word or key symbol is going to be, because we have a lot of things to cover today. And so I know that some people have supper club after this. Some people have football games to go to and things like that. So I need you to either get the come on, hurry up, or spoon something. Just give me some, just keep me moving somehow, because we have to cover about 200 years of history, which isn't that big of a deal, because if you've been with us, we started in Genesis 1:1 and realized that God was enough without us before he created anything. And so we covered all of eternity in one Sunday, so that was pretty cool. But I do need your guys' help, because we're going to try to cover 19 points. And I said, Emery, we're going to do 19 points today. And she's like, no, that's not okay. And so, again, I need you guys to kind of say, Matt, you've said enough. Let's move on. So,
take the word, lunch can wait.
Yes. Well, yeah, we've got.
I'm going to get lynched.
Yes. I'm super excited about what we're going to cover today. And so that's my intro, is just keep me on track, just push me somehow. So what we're going to do is we are going to keep going on this series. If you haven't been with us, what these pictures represent is eternity from the past all the way into the future, and we're going through all of the Bible. And so where we're at right now is in 1 Kings. So if you've got a Bible, I would encourage you to turn to 1 Kings, and we are going to take the next 3 weeks. This week we're going to look at the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, and then next week we're going to look at the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and then the third week we're going to look at the 400 years of silence, which is just a fascinating time period because there's no Bible to back it up. It's just 400 years without the Bible. So this week, what we're going to be looking at is the 19 kings of Israel from 925 BC to 721 BC. And we're going to look at this history. So we're going to start with the first king, and the first king is Jeroboam. Jeroboam. He was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you remember a couple weeks ago when we last did a message in this series, what we learned was that Solomon had disobeyed God. And so Solomon married 700 wives and had hundreds of concubines. And as a result, God said, hey, this isn't okay. We're going to take this kingdom and it's going to be destroyed because you didn't follow what I asked you to do. And so Rehoboam, his son, becomes king, and Rehoboam, we called him an idiot because he basically took advice and said, no, I don't want that advice, I'm going to throw it away, and just moved on. And as a result of Rehoboam being an idiot, the nation split into two kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom of Israel, what we're focusing on today, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Jeroboam became the first ruler, the first king of the northern nation, the northern kingdom of Israel. And he basically started a cult. Now, when you guys think of a cult, what do you think of, or how would you define that? This is where you get to interact.
You drink Kool-Aid and all die.
Okay, Kool-Aid. Some people that didn't survive very long because they drank the wrong stuff. Okay, anything else? Control. Yep. Yeah. I'm not going to try because I'm going to fail too. Yes, I agree with you.
Worshipping a false god, right?
Worshipping a false god, yeah. I don't have a perfect definition, but here's kind of what I'm thinking with a cult. A cult is taking a lot of truth and then mixing it with a little bit of lies. So you've got a lot of things that sound really good, and you've got a lot of examples of that. You take a ship that has 1 degree off course from the very beginning. It's only 1 degree, but it winds up totally missing the mark way down the road because it was just a little bit of lies at the beginning. You look at the Titanic. The Titanic sunk partly because the rivets that they used were substandard. They bought cheaper rivets because they're like, it'll be fine. And they hit an iceberg and it wasn't fine. That's just the type of things that you mix in. Again, I thought about doing this, but then I was like, we got kids here, we can't do this. So if you take purified water and you drop in a little bit of rat poison, I mean, who's going to want to drink that? It's just 1 drop of poison, but it still infects the entire thing. And that's what I view as a cult, is that you take a lot of truth that sounds really good. People aren't drinking Kool-Aid just because they're like, hey, I want to die. They're saying, hey, I've got a reason to do this, but it's mixed with lies and it becomes very destructive. And so what we see is that Jeroboam starts this, and we're going to come back to Jeroboam at the end. He reigned 22 years. And then in 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 33 and 34, it describes his ruling. And I'm going to have you guys read some verses because we're just going to try to breeze through this again. You guys are almost failing me already. You guys have to be like, man, come on. Hurry up a little bit. 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 33 and 34. Here is what it says. It says, even after this, Jeroboam did not repent of his evil way, but again made priests for the high places from the ranks of the people. He ordained whoever so desired it, and they became priests of the high places. This was the sin that caused the house of Jeroboam to be cut off and obliterated from the face of the earth. So from the very beginning, Jeroboam isn't doing what God asked him to do. We look at the second king, King Nadab. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 20 is kind of where you see the story of him. And he's the son of Jeroboam. He reigned 2 years. And if you've got a Bible, I'd encourage you to read 1 Kings 15:26. Somebody read that for me, please.
But he did what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his father, continuing the sins that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit.
Okay, so Nadab did what his dad did, committed evil. You go to the third king. The third king is King Baasha. I'm gonna slaughter some of these. Baasha, and Baasha conspired and he assassinated Nadab and all of Jeroboam's relatives. And that was a prophecy that was made, is because, hey, you've done evil, you didn't do what I asked you to do. And so Baasha comes in and he obliterates the entire family so that nobody can kind of rise up and be a part of the kingdom. He reigned 24 years, and in 1 Kings 15:34. Somebody read that for us.
He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin which he made Israel to sin.
Okay, does that sound familiar? Okay,
So he killed all the people and then he did the same thing again.
right, exactly. Exactly. No, this is good. This is good stuff. I just think about that, and the note that I put in my notes, Caroline, and this goes right along with what you said, is maybe to get off the crazy train of dysfunction. At some point, you have to evaluate and say, where's the dysfunction so that we don't continue to follow in everybody else's footsteps. But this guy doesn't do it. And Elah, the son, I kind of color-coded these, so as you're going through and you're saying, hey, we changed colors, it's because this is a different family. So that's kind of what that means, just so you have some context. Elah was his son. Elah reigned 2 years, and he was assassinated by this next king because he was out partying and he was drunk, and so this guy just came in and was like, hey, I'll take your throne from you. So Zimri is the next guy. He's the next king. He kills all of Elah's family. So Elah and all of his descendants, they don't get to reign anymore. Now it's Zimri. And he reigns for 7 days. 7 days. We don't have a whole lot of information on him because he only reigned for 7 days. But his failed conspiracy results in his suicide. He winds up seeing that this conspiracy and assassination attempt isn't going to pan out the way that he wanted it to. So he sets his own house on fire and he commits suicide, and just as one of 5 suicides recorded in the Bible. And as a result of that, the next guy comes on the scene, Omri. He seizes control from Zimri, and he reigns for 12 years. Go ahead.
What happened to Zimri?
Zimri?
Or no, Tibni, Tibni.
Omri and that guy were both captains or generals in the army, and they kind of fought it out, and so neither one of them really became king until Omri took over from that guy. So he's not an official king. He kind of just had a power struggle there for a second, and we're going to move on. Again, I'm sorry. I'm bulldozing through this stuff. He seizes control, and then he does something that's pretty important within the rest of the history of even the New Testament. He moves the capital of Israel to Samaria. And so when we see the Samaritans in John chapter 4, when Jesus has this conversation with the woman at the well in Samaria, this is a key thing that we see throughout Scripture. So if you see 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 25 and 26, would somebody be willing to read that?
Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord and acted more wickedly than all who were before him, for he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sins which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their idols. Okay,
so he did evil in the sight of the Lord. You see his son of Omri is Ahab. In 1 Kings chapter 16, we see the promotion of Ahab. He is married to Jezebel. Jezebel has become a name that a lot of people don't really want to be called. And it all starts from this lady Jezebel. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 25, it's fascinating reading the different translations and that word that's behind there. It says that Jezebel incited or stirred up Ahab to commit all the evil that he committed. And so he's married to this lady that's not just like a passive, like, I'm going to go make you a sandwich, Ahab. That was not her personality. Her personality was, hey, let's get into some trouble. Let's do this. Let's kill this person. Let's take out these people. Like, she was very much a part of the evil that Ahab was a part of. And Ahab had a nemesis, which is just an interesting thing to think about. There's like 6 or 7 chapters devoted to Ahab and his nemesis, who is Elijah. And Elijah was the prophet of God. And so really, as Ahab is focusing his attention on Elijah, he's really trying to fight against God. And I just think that that's fascinating, because when you look at Elijah, Elijah is a type or a picture of Jesus when you get into the New Testament. And what that means is that when you look at what Elijah did, it was very similar to what Jesus was doing. In John chapter 1, it talks about what Jesus did. It says he came to his own people, and even they rejected him. That's what Elijah did. He was coming to Israel and saying, hey, we've got to get this figured out. We've got to get on the right track. And they rejected him. Ahab rejected him. In verse 12 of John chapter 1, it says, but to all who believed in his name and accepted him, he gave the right to be called children of God. I just think about that. Jesus came to his people and said, I want to adopt you. I want to welcome you in. And yet they said, no, we don't want any part of that. And this is exactly what happens with Ahab, is Ahab is offered grace over and over and over again. And Elijah says, come be a part of this. And they say, no, I don't want this. I don't want this at all. He reigned for 22 years, and then his son becomes king, Ahaziah, and he caused brand new ships to sink just by being in proximity. There's a king of Judah that comes to Ahaziah and says, hey, we want to make some ships. We want to make this army together. And the Judah king makes this agreement. They build these new ships. They bring them over, and they sink. And so the king of Judah says, I don't want to be part of this anymore. Just because of being around him, it's not a good deal. He reigned for 2 years, and then if you just briefly glance at 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 52, you will see a common pattern of things that we've seen before. What does it say?
He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in the way of his mother, and in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin.
Right. Did the same thing. Now, the next person that we see is not the son of Ahaziah, but it's Joram, who is another son of Ahab. And so Joram, this is a confusing name because Joram or Jehoram, those two people are the exact same person. And the super confusing thing about it is when you read through the Bible, the king of Judah has the exact same name at the exact same time. And then on top of that, with the translation, sometimes they refer to him as Joram, sometimes they refer to him as Jehoram, and so it's just a really confusing thing, so you have to read the context very carefully. But this guy was the next king, and he reigned for 12 years, and the best thing about his reign was another prophet, and his name was Elisha. And you see the interaction between these guys, the king and the prophet Elisha, and Elisha keeps doing good things for the country, and Joram kind of just hops on his coattails and says, yeah, well, let's do what he does sometimes. And then he's like, no, I don't really want to be a part of that. And so he runs the country into the ground. And then says, no, let's come back to Elisha. And there's just this back and forth. But the best thing that you really see out of his reign is that he followed the prophet of God. The next person is another conspirator, Jehu. He conspires and he assassinates 2 kings. He assassinates the king in Israel, which was Joram, and then he also assassinates, just by proximity, the king that was in Judah at the time. So he assassinates both of Israel's kings at the same time, and then he reigns for 28 years, and he's promised a 4-generation dynasty. If you look at Jehu, he's a fascinating person, and we're going to look a little bit more at him again at the end. But as he's reigning, what you're starting to see is the king of Aram, especially the nation of Aram, starting to come in and starting to take chunks out of the nation of Israel, and the nation is starting to shrink. The next king is Jehoahaz. I practice these, and then I'm looking at them, and I'm like, I'm going to say him. Jehoahaz, he was pushed around by the king of Aram. He lost a lot of battles. 2 Kings chapter 13, if you don't mind somebody reading those, that would be great. 2 Kings 13:2.
He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and followed the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. He did not part from them.
Okay. You guys see See what's happening here? This is why we've got a 19-point sermon that we can just rush through, right? There's a consistency that is happening here. And you look at this, and after he reigns 17 years, what we see is the next king is still in the family, Jehoash. And 2 Kings 13:11, if you look at that, it says the exact same thing. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did the exact same thing as the rest of his family was doing. He reigned 16 years, and he attacks Judah, the southern kingdom. And if you remember in one of these, in presence, we were talking about the temple and how glorious and how much gold there was. He attacks Judah for the gold. He takes some gold out of the temple, and he went to bringing it back to Samaria, and they live high and fat and sassy off of the gold that they get out of there. The next king is Jeroboam II. Now, if you want to name your child after somebody, I wouldn't recommend naming it after somebody that did evil in the sight of the Lord, but they did. Jeroboam II. At this point, his army is almost all but gone. It's been shrunk because of all the battles with the king of Aram and with the king of Judah. And in 2 Kings 14:24, it gives a little resume again. And what does the resume say? What's it say, Caroline?
I said he did evil in the sight of the Lord.
He did evil in the sight of the Lord. So he hasn't gotten off the track. Nobody's gotten off the track. And he reigned for 41 years. 41 years of doing evil in the sight of the Lord. And then you have Zechariah. Zechariah is in 2 Kings 15:9. Gives another little brief sketch. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Reigned 6 months. And his prophecy was fulfilled, because back in 2 Kings 15:12, what it talks about is when Jehu reigned, he was promised 4 generations down the line, and the 4th generation hits. 6 months into his reign, he's conspired and killed and assassinated publicly by the next king, King Shalom. And you see that he reigns 1 month. So this is just like getting chaotic at this point. People are turning over. The next king is Menahem, and he was bribed. He was the one who bribed Assyria at this point, because the king of Aram had been conquered by Assyria. Assyria had come in and become this threat to the nations around. And so Menahem takes the gold that was stolen by a king previous, and he says, hey, I'm going to send some of this gold to Assyria so that we can have some peace and leave us alone. We don't want to have any part of you. So in 2 Kings 15:18, he gives the resume. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Again, and he reigned for 10 years. Now his son comes in, and it's Pekahiah. He maintains the status quo. He keeps bribing the Assyrians for peace. His reign was 2 years, and again, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And we're winding down. This is number 18 of 19, so we're getting close. Pekah. He conspires, he assassinates Pekahiah, and looking at his life, one of the things that is really interesting is that he attacks Judah. He takes thousands and thousands of people captive from Judah. And then he says, oh, we probably shouldn't have done this. So he returns all the people to Judah. And then Judah says, we didn't like that you just stole a bunch of our people. And so they go to Assyria and say, hey, go attack Israel, because they just took a bunch of our people. And Assyria's like, okay. And so Assyria becomes their bad guy and starts attacking them. And in 2 Kings 15:28, it describes Pekah's reign for the 20 years as evil. And they're starting to see these turbulent waters around them, that all of a sudden Assyria is on the rise, Assyria is coming, it's at their doorstep, and they're having some really big issues. And for these 20 years, as Pekah's as he's reigning, what we see is this next guy comes on the scene, because I'm sure that they're seeing, here's Assyria looming over us. Hoshea comes in and kills Pekah and says, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to get rid of Assyria. And Hoshea becomes the last king of Israel. And he moves from being the king to a puppet king by the nation of Assyria, to lying to Assyria and saying, hey, we don't have to obey Assyria anymore. And then he becomes a prisoner and taken to Assyria, and that is the end of Israel, the northern kingdom in Samaria. That is 204 years of history condensed down into a few minutes. And I look at that and I say, the theme that we see is what? What do you guys get out of that? Evil in the sight of the Lord. There's not one king. Somebody said, hey, if you were to do this message, and I was talking to my wife and some other people, but if you're to do this message, just separate them from the good kings and the bad kings. Like, well, we can't, because there's no good kings in this. There's all bad kings. And so I look at this and I say, okay, what do we get out of this? Like, I mean, I don't think that any of us are going to be king, but we do have this responsibility to kind of look at this and say, what do we apply? So you look at this last part of these 19 kings, and as Assyria is besieging Samaria and as everything is winding down, what I want us to do is I want to look at one lesson that I think that we take away from the entire history of the nation of Israel. And if we look at this one lesson, the lesson is partial obedience is disobedience. Partial obedience is disobedience. I love the phrase, I don't use it very often, but I love the phrase, close only counts in hand grenades, horseshoes, and slow dancing. Those are the three things that I learned in my life, is that close only counts in hand grenades, horseshoes, and slow dancing. And I look at that, and that's exactly what we see in Jeroboam. If you got a Bible, I would encourage you to turn back to 1 Kings chapter 12, and we're going to focus on Jeroboam, because if anything, the root, the starting point of all the evil started with the first king, King Jeroboam. And Jeroboam started with partial obedience. He never got to the point where he obeyed God and he did what God asked him to do. He started his kingdom, he started his rulership with partial obedience. And so in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25, here's how it starts. It says, Jeroboam said to himself, the kingdom might now return to the house of David. This split has just happened in the nation. We want to be wary of this. In verse 27, if these people regularly go out to offer sacrifices in the Lord's temple in Jerusalem, the heart of these people will return to their Lord, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and go back to the king of Judah. Jeroboam becomes king, and his major concern is me. It's self-preservation. It's what happens. What happens if they don't like me anymore and they come after me? They're going to kill me. And basically, Jeroboam's disobedience, or his partial obedience, came from insecurity. It came from what ifs. What would happen if it's out of my control? Because I don't think he was anti-God. He wasn't like, hey, let's get rid of all this and start a new religion. He was like, okay, I agree with a lot of this stuff, but what about me? And he takes that mindset into what he does next. What he does in verse 28, he says he sought advice. I don't know who he got advice from, but he got some bad advice. Then he made 2 golden calves. And he said to the people, going to Jerusalem is too difficult for you. Israel, here are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Here's what he does. He redefines God. He divides the family. You look at that, and what he does is he starts off and he says, we've got this God. He took us from Egypt. We're just going to change a little bit of him so he's a little bit more palatable and a little bit more contained. We're going to make some idols that kind of represent this new God that we have. We're going to just take what we have and form it into what we want him to be. And then secondly, what he does is he says, I know it's way too difficult for you to travel a little bit to Jerusalem, to this nice temple that Solomon made for you. Let's just go ahead and make our own way of it. And so he kind of puts the wedge that's already there and he just shoves it even further down so that these two people groups have absolutely no reason to come together and to be together anymore. And so he redefines God and he divides the family. You keep going in verse 29, and he says, he set up one in Bethel. We're talking about these idols. He set up one in Bethel and put the other in Dan. This led to sin. I mean, that should be a no-duh type of a statement, but this led to sin. The people walked in procession before one of the calves all the way to Dan. Jeroboam also made shrines on the high places and made priests from the ranks of the people who were not Levites. The next thing he does is he promotes bogus priests. Remember, a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the temple, what does a priest do? What's the job of a priest?
They mediate between God and men.
Right, they mediate. They are the go-between. Now, this past week or two, I went to a bank that was not my bank. And I did it on accident. I didn't mean to go to this bank. I thought, hey, I need to get some money, so I'm going to go to this bank. And I send the card, and the teller has to tell me, you are at the wrong bank. Very embarrassing. And so I found a new bank and I got some money. But what I realized is that when you go to the wrong person and the wrong location and you try to get something from that person, you're not going to receive what you want to receive. This is the exact same thing that's happening here. Jeroboam says, well, anybody can be a priest, right? Anybody can be this go-between between God and us, right? And so it says, like, willy-nilly, you want to be a priest? I'll appoint you as a priest. You look qualified to be a priest. I'll make you a priest. And he just starts promoting these bogus priests. And when you don't have right priests, you're never going to have a connection to the person that you want to get connected to, and specifically God. You're never going to have a relationship with God if you don't have an actual priest in between you and God. Now, that gets convoluted because in Catholicism and other religions, like, here's the priest, here's the person that we go to. The only priest that we have, the only mediator that we have is Jesus. Amen. Jesus is the only mediator. And then you look at verse 32 and we see the last part of this imaginary worship. Verse 32 says, Jeroboam made a festival in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like the festival in Judah. He's like, I think we could replicate this. I think we can make something new. He offered sacrifices on the altar. He made this offering in Bethel to sacrifice the calves he had made. He had also stationed the priests in Bethel for the high places he had made. He offered sacrifices on the altar he had set up in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month. He chose this month on his own. He made a festival for the Israelites, offered sacrifices on the altar, and burned incense. In other words, he made up some sort of worship ceremony ritual and said, this is good enough. I like how this sounds. He made up festivals and practices for the worship of God. I think about this, and Jeroboam basically took, if you take your Bible, took the first 5 books of the Bible and said, yeah, this is a pretty good part. I'm going to keep this. No, I don't really like this part, and just rips it out. Says, we're not going to use that anymore. Oh, I kind of like this idea over here. No, I don't like this over here. He takes partial truth, mixes it with the stuff that he wants, and out comes a redefined God, a divided family, bogus priests, and imaginary worship. He basically takes partial obedience and says, that is good enough. I don't normally do this, but I feel like it's kind of important in this context. You look at groups within our nation, within this world, there are so many groups that do exactly what Jeroboam does. You look at the LDS Church, you look at Jehovah's Witnesses, you look at even Catholicism and even many mainline denominations in our nation. You look at Islam, you look at Judaism. All those things are springing out of here's what I want to follow and here's what I don't want to follow. I'll take some of this and I'm not going to take that. And at the end of it, what comes about as a result of partial obedience? It opens the door for full disobedience. That's a slippery slope. And as soon as you decide to start picking out and choosing, what you see is the next 9 kings of Israel just say, hey, we're going to do whatever we want. We're not going to just do this. We're going to introduce Baal worship. We're going to introduce Ashtaroth, and we're going to introduce child sacrifices and killing our kids. We're going to introduce abortion. We're going to introduce all these different things that wind up resulting in God saying to every single one of these kings, you've walked in what is evil. Evil is not like a light word. It's not like it's evil because they've just full-blown opened the door for disobedience. And 9 kings go by, and then you see the 10th king, and that's King Jehu. And I want to look at King Jehu for a minute. In 2 Kings chapter 10, if you've got a Bible again, I turn over there, 2 Kings chapter 10. And what we see is the 10th king had good intentions. He's thinking, okay, we've gotten way off track. We need to get back on track to what God wants us to do. So let's try to figure this out. And so he says, I am going to root out the evil leadership. I'm going to take away the evil leadership. 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 17. When Jehu came to Samaria, he struck down all who remained from the house of Ahab in Samaria, until he had annihilated his house. He took care of all the leadership, all the potential leaders, everybody in Ahab's house, to the point where it says in another place that there was no possibility that Ahab's family could ever rule again. And it says, according to the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. So he roots out the evil leaders. There's no chance of these evil leaders being there. He does the first thing. The second thing, he says, I'm going to root out all the evil worship that's in the country. 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 24. It says, now Jehu had stationed 80 men outside, and he warned them, whoever allows any of the men I am placing in your hands to escape will forfeit his life for theirs. He basically tricks everybody, and he says in this statement that I love, he says, Ahab worship Baal? Yeah, right. I will worship Baal. And everybody's like, yeah, Baal. And so they all gather into the temple of Baal, and here's what happens next in verse 25. He says, when he finished offering the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guards and officers, go in and kill them. Don't let anyone out. So they struck them down with the sword. Then the guards and officers threw the bodies out and went into the inner room of the temple of Baal. They brought out the pillar of the temple of Baal and burned it, and they tore down the pillar of Baal. Then they tore down the temple of Baal and made it a latrine. They made it a bathroom, which it still is today. Verse 28, this is key. Jehu eliminated Baal worship from Israel, but he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had caused Israel to commit worshiping the gold calves which were in Bethel and Dan. Nevertheless, the Lord said to Jehu, because you've done well in carrying out what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, 4 generations of your sons will sit on the throne of Israel. Stop there for a second. Think about that. He annihilates all of Baal's worship, and God's like, thank you. I'm going to bless you with 4 generations of sons that are going to sit on the throne. That's an amazing thing that just happened, but he doesn't go far enough. Imagine, just for a second, what would have happened if Jehu would have gone all the way, and he would have said, I am going to completely obey God. Imagine the blessing that he just missed out on. Imagine the blessing that God would have showered on him as a result of full obedience. Oftentimes we say, well, I'm going to do it till I'm comfortable. Or I'm going to do it until I'm okay with it. And we miss out on the rest of it. Like we kind of just play around and say, I'm going to do this stuff because I'm okay with it. But we miss out on the whole thing, the whole picture of what God has for us. Verse 31. Yet Jehu was not careful to follow the instruction of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins that Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. And sadly, this is as close to revival as Israel ever got to experience. Back to the status quo. Jehu settles for redefined God, divided family, bogus priests, and imaginary worship. They get back to that point, and I just imagine, like, I thought about this as a kid, like, it would be so great if a president of the United States came into power and he just, like, got rid of all the bad things, you know, like, if you just had one guy that was committed and just worked against, and if you just had one king in Israel that just went against everything and said, hey, we're going to start over, we're going to scrap it, we're going to completely obey, if they humbled their ego and did it, like, man, that would have been an amazing turnaround in the nation of Israel. But for 200 years, never happened. Never happened. They just kept going back to the sin. And I sit here and I think, what would have happened if one of those guys would have done it? What would have that nation have looked like? And I love this because God almost like takes the veil and says, hey, just look between the veil just a little bit so you can see what this might have looked like. 2 Chronicles chapter 30. We get a glimpse of what could have been if they would have completely obeyed God. This is kind of where we're headed, and then we'll wrap this up. 2 Chronicles chapter 30 gives us a glimpse of what could have been if they wouldn't have settled for partial obedience. I spliced this up, and so I'm going to try to walk us through this a little bit quickly. But in 2 Chronicles 30, what we start off by seeing is the king of Judah is Hezekiah at this point. And it says, Hezekiah sent word throughout all Israel and Judah, and he also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh to come to the Lord's temple in Jerusalem to observe the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel. All of a sudden,
Sorry,
do you have
blown
something?
away by that.
Do you have something?
Yeah, it's just, so he's reaching out to what became Samaria.
Right.
He's saying children of Joseph,
Right.
Ephraim, come back, come home.
On the other side, what we're going to see next week is Hezekiah is one of the few kings that like decides, hey, I'm going to completely obey. And Hezekiah, as a result, is like, wait a minute, we're not supposed to be divided. This wasn't God's plan. Hey, let's come back together. And so he kind of throws out this olive branch and says, hey, let's have peace. Let's offer this. And so he offers it to Israel and Judah. And this is exciting stuff, because what we see is in verse 7, Hezekiah sends out this letter to all of Israel, all of Judah, and Israel gets this letter, and Israel hears this. They hear, don't be unfaithful to the Lord. In verse 8 it says, don't become obstinate towards the Lord. Instead, serve the Lord your God so that he may turn his burning anger away from you. For when you return to the Lord, your brothers and your sons will receive mercy in the presence of their captors, and will return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful. He will not turn his face away from you if you return to him. He's offering this open door of like, you can come and be a part of this. And Israel looks at it and says, nah. You look at this, and in the inhabitants, it says that the inhabitants laughed at them and mocked them. Why would we want that? We've got our status quo over here. We're comfortable over here. Why would we change anything? But here's the beauty. Verse 11. But some humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. There's this fraction that say, hey, I want to try something more than what we're trying right now. Verse 15. It says they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. They did it on the second month. They're supposed to do it on the first month because they just couldn't get everything together. And so they're like, hey, we're just going to do this because we want to do it. And so on the second month, they go ahead and slaughter the Passover lamb. But Hezekiah interceded for them, saying, may the Lord God provide atonement on behalf of whoever sets his whole heart on seeking God, the Lord, the God of his ancestors, even though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary. I love that, because you've got all these people that are coming and they haven't been consecrated. They're not prepared to worship God. They're not really in that situation where they've been following God's rules up to this point. And Hezekiah sees that, and all the priests are probably freaking out. They're like, we're not supposed to accept any of these people. They're not ready. They're not pure. They're not clean. And Hezekiah's like, no, we got to invite them in, and I'm going to pray for them. And you look at what happens in verse 20. So the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. That's a miracle in itself. Like, that's cool. That's cool. And then it says in verse 21, the Israelites who were present in Jerusalem observed the festival of unleavened bread 7 days with great joy. And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day after day with loud instruments. And they're having such a good time that in verse 23 it says the whole congregation decided to observe 7 more days. So they observed 7 days with joy. Like, all of a sudden they're seeing this healing. They're seeing this thing come back together. It's a beautiful, like, I don't know, like the end of those movies where you want to cry. This is the time where you should start crying, because like you see these people that are just like together for the first time in hundreds of years. And they're worshiping God the way that they're supposed to be worshiping God. In verse 26 it says, there was great rejoicing in Jerusalem, for nothing like this was known since the days of Solomon, son of David, the king of Israel. They're looking back and they're saying, this is what it could have been. This is where we should have been. And in verse 27 it says, then the priests and the Levites stood to bless the people. Get this. God heard them. And their prayer came into his holy dwelling place in heaven. Think about the holy God that we were praising this morning. We don't deserve to be with him at all. And these people were settling for the status quo back then. They didn't deserve to be with God at all. And yet God heard them in heaven. God accepted them. And this is all the calm. These 2 weeks are the calm before the storm of the Assyrians come march into Israel and just utterly disperse and destroy. But we have to understand that this moment in time is God's passion on display, his forgiveness, his mercy, his grace, his desire to be connected with us, his unity, his love, all of that in a condensed 2-week period, in spite of the 200 years of evil. God shows and says, this is what I want you to be a part of. This is what my desire was for you. And you settled for partial obedience, and in your partial obedience, it went to full-blown disobedience, and in your disobedience, you missed out. You missed out. And even though God offers this, Israel never was interested. And just in the history of what we see in 721 BC, the Assyrians, they took the Jews, they scattered them throughout their kingdom, which we call the diaspora. And from this point on, the exact ethnic composition, this is a quote, is utterly unknown as far as the people who lived in Samaria to that point. Because the Assyrians would come in and they took a bunch of the Jewish people and they said, hey, go live somewhere else. We don't want you to cause up a rebellion here. And then they took all the people that they had already conquered and they just dumped them back into Samaria and to Israel and said, hey, you guys live here because we don't want you to have any part of a rebellion anywhere else. And so all of a sudden, this group of people is no longer Jewish people. It's kind of a crossbreed in all sorts of cultures and all sorts of people. And it all happened because partial obedience is disobedience. I want to read one last couple verses and then we'll kind of wrap this up. 2 Kings chapter 7 verse 21 says, when the Lord tore Israel, this is a synopsis of everything that we've just talked about this morning. When the Lord tore Israel from the house of David, Israel made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Then Jeroboam led Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit grave sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins that Jeroboam committed and did not turn away from them. Finally, the Lord removed Israel from his presence, just as he had declared through all his servants the prophets. So Israel had been exiled to Assyria from their homeland to this very day.
And I approve.
And Richard.
Yep.
And we see that, and the big word for 204 years, you read it over and over again, was evil. That was the status quo. We might say, well, it wasn't that bad, but in God's mind, it was. It was evil. And we look at that and say, what do we do with that? Again, hopefully you're not going to be an evil king in your life, but there are two applications that I want to present to you that we see from this. One for personal health and then one for as a church as we're on mission. The first one for personal health is stop settling for self and accept grace. We need to accept grace because God's grace chased down every single one of these kings. You look at all these kings and God offered grace. He answered their prayers. He gave them opportunities. He gave them prophets. He gave blessing even when they were sinful. You see all these positive things happen because God's pursuit of them was in grace and in his love for them. I had a time in Wyoming when I was at college where me and my friends would go after dark to cemeteries and random fields because there was just so much space in Wyoming, and we'd play all sorts of games. And so we went out to this cornfield, and it was pitch black outside, and we were just trying to scare each other. That was kind of what we did to get a high or whatever. We would scare each other. And I remember I was running through a field, and I saw a shadow of something that I thought was like the size of a dog. And I don't know, I'm a tall person, but when I have something that's small that's just sprinting at me, it freaks me out, especially in the dark. And so there's this shadow that's coming at me, and I see it coming. It gets so close to me that I bail and I just jump and huddle into a fetal position, and I'm done. I find out that it's my friend that's running at me, and it's just a shadow in the weird thing that happened. It just played with my mind. But I freaked out, and I realized that thing was coming after me, and it was going to find me, and I had to stop and drop. God's grace is pursuing you. And at some point, you can either keep running away from it, or you can stop, drop, and accept it. And I look at that, and the kings never did, but you can. The kings never accepted God's grace. Because what happens is pride will insulate us from God's grace. Pride will either say, hey, I'm not good enough, I can never accept God's love, God can never love me, and that's the excuse we make. Or we either say, well, I'm too ambitious, I'm too successful, I don't really need God that much right now. And we have to get to a point where we say, no, I'm not enough. I need God's grace. The second thing that I want us to leave with is this idea of being on mission. If we're a church that is moving towards something, if we're a church for the unchurched, we have to take this seriously, that we have to be faithful to Jesus. We have to be faithful to Jesus. The few loud ones, and this is so common, I think we talked about this before, that the few loud ones, the small percentages, will lead the masses. And it's super frustrating. Why does this few percentage points influence the rest of the 90%? Like, why does it work that way? And you look at the 19 kings led this nation, this whole nation towards destruction and all this, and none of them were faithful. But yet we see stories of faithful people throughout the stories of the kings. You see people like Elijah and Elisha. You see the 100 prophets that were hid by Obadiah. You see Amos and Hosea and Micaiah and the 7,000 that were held faithful throughout the reign of Ahab. You see these people that rise up and they're faithful, and yet we look and we say, well, what impact did that make? Like, the nation didn't turn around. The people didn't change. Like, that's not fair. Like, if nothing else, that's not fair. And they didn't change the trajectory of Israel. But understand this. We are not called to win battles. We're not even called to win wars for the name of Christ. Jesus is the conqueror. Jesus is the victorious one. We are not the ones that are fighting to win. We are fighting to be faithful. And it's super frustrating because I look around at our culture and I see like abortion, slavery, gender, and identity, broken homes, sexuality, education, economy, anything else that feels like a battle that we're trying to fight against. It feels like we're losing. And it's super frustrating. Like, God, we need to, as the church, storm the gates of hell. Like, nothing can, we want to conquer things, but we're not told to be winners. We're told to be faithful. We're told to be faithful. And that sounds defeating, and it probably should feel defeating. Because in the end, you and I are not enough. East Valley Bible Church is not enough. God is enough. We're called to be faithful. Which again is super frustrating. Like, this isn't like the, let's go do something now, but this is what we have to come to grips with, is that we are the one that are called to be faithful. And in our faithfulness, we are expecting, we are waiting, we are hoping, and we are saying, Jesus, you are going to come and you are going to set things right. We're counting on you to win this battle because we can't win it. We're counting on you to win this war because we can't win it. All we're called to do is to keep fighting and to keep being faithful. Because evil is in our world. Evil is all around us. And as the church, we're not called to say, hey, we're going to defeat evil. We're called to be faithful.